Hello, everyone. This is your host, Philip Reiner. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on technology for global security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. For today's podcast, we are joined by our colleague Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute. We engaged with MIT's Nancy Leveson, and we'll give her a chance here in a moment to go into a bit of her background from her perspective. But the conversation today will focus on some truly critical issues associated with building and maintaining large-scale complex systems, what to avoid, how to ensure resilience, particularly in the context of NC3. Nancy is someone who has worked on some of the toughest systems engineering challenges you really can think of, to include space shuttle accidents, the Deepwater Horizon accident, among an array of others. We welcome Nancy, are really glad that she's here with us, and welcome her to the pod. And to start things off, we'll turn to Dr. Peter Hayes to initiate with the first question.
Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today. It was nearly 3 years ago that I went searching for someone really conversant with the high end of software to control complex systems in the context of nuclear command, control, and communications. And I was amazed to find someone who had gone into it in such depth, not surprisingly at MIT, but you've been doing this for a long time. How did you get into this field?
Well, I originally have degrees in mathematics, management, and computer science, and mostly I worked in very mathematical arenas. I also studied some cognitive psychology at the graduate level for a while. But safety engineering isn't taught at universities, and I got involved in it only after taking my first job as an assistant professor right out of my PhD program. A local company called me and told me they were building a torpedo that at that time had more computers than most defense systems had. About 15 microprocessors. They were really concerned about this and didn't know how to ensure safety. And I really didn't much about it, but I helped a little. Mostly what I did was learn from them. And they turned out those were some of the most experienced system safety engineers in the world, who'd been working on Minuteman missile systems and the intercontinental ballistic missile systems and I did help them a little, but mostly all I did was learn from them. And after the project, I decided I wasn't too sure about the long-term viability of the approach that they'd taken for that torpedo. And I thought, well, I'd work more on the problem for about 6 months, solve it, and then go back to my lovely, but not very practical math. And it's now 39 years later, but I think I finally solved it. And since that early torpedo project, I've worked in most every safety critical industry: aviation, space, defense, of course, petrochemicals, automobiles, nuclear power, hospital patient safety, and so on. I've helped to write many accident reports, including the official government report on the Deepwater Horizon loss, the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, the Texas City oil refinery explosion, a V-22, that's Osprey aircraft crash, and many lesser well-known ones. I've also consulted in just about every industry on how to prevent accidents. So I've learned a lot along the way. And in addition, I've taught and done research for almost 40 years in system engineering, safety engineering, software engineering, human factors, and engineering management. And recently, I've become more involved in cybersecurity along with safety. As you noted, almost all the systems I get involved with are very complex, very software intensive, and very critical. Unfortunately, all of this experience has made me fairly cynical about the directions that we're going in these fields. I'm worried that we're not making progress, but are simply repeating the mistakes of the past.
So, Nancy, I wondered if you could explain to the listeners one of the points you make in the paper, and I'm going to quote you here. You argue that, quote, we need to resist the temptation to use sexy, new, and untrustworthy engineering techniques on nuclear command and control communication systems of the future. I'm worried the temptation will be too great to resist. Unquote. What did you mean by that statement? It's a pretty strong statement.
Well, it's fun to use new technology to play with and create Rube Goldberg type designs. We rarely have to show that the technology works, or more important, that we can prove and assure that it will work. That's not fun. It's much more fun to create fabulously complex designs and see what we can do. In truth, we're creating systems that are inherently untrustworthy and cannot be assured to be trustworthy. We can't predict with a high level of confidence that they'll work, nor can we, in many cases, even understand ourselves how they work.
Well, Nancy, how did we succeed in the past in making trustworthy systems for this kind of control problem?
The most successful systems of the past were simple and used rigorous, straightforward processes. The space shuttle software is a notable example. There were a remarkably small number of errors were found in this software during flight for the almost 30 years of its use. There are no systems today with this level of reliability. So, what did they do? Well, they used a disciplined, rigorous, and structured development process, extensive record keeping and documentation, extensive and realistic testing and code reviews, rigorous and detailed standards, and so on. The very highest level of professional engineering behavior techniques. They also had a highly professional development culture, not the sort of cowboy culture of many software development efforts today. Now, there were two shuttle accidents, and they remind us that safety involves more than just technical prowess. The two causes involve poor management decision making. So we also need to manage these systems during operation to ensure that shortcuts aren't being taken, complacency doesn't get out of hand, decision making is collaborative and well informed about the risks that are being taken. What we learned from the shuttle software and other successful projects of the past is that high quality software is possible, but it requires an investment of time and resources. Quality has to be the primary focus and not speed and cost. It takes time to do things right, and it's easy to save money and time by using slapdash methods.
So, Nancy, are we moving in the right direction or in the wrong direction at the moment?
Well, unfortunately, I see us moving rapidly in the wrong direction. New development approaches are being touted that actually argue that design, for example, should come before requirements, that we learn by doing and we can't know what we need to do before we start doing it. But that's simply untrue. In the past, we used sophisticated system analysis to determine what needed to be done before we started. These are no longer extensively used or even taught in our schools. The result has been a very large number of failed projects, particularly the more ambitious ones. Our projects are enormously large today. Consider the F 35 software, or the F 35 itself had 8,000 engineers, 4,000 of them software engineers. They were spread all over the country to ensure congressional support for the program. So, how do you get 8,000 engineers to build something successfully without rigorous development and management processes? It just seems like our recent attempts to provide highly trustworthy systems have been compromised by gratuitous and unnecessary complexity in the designs and inadequate development and maintenance processes.
Given this complexity that's creeping, or perhaps not just creeping, but racing into various systems, are we seeing accidents today that are different to those in the past?
Yeah, that's the interesting part is the causes of accidents are changing. 50 years ago, we used to assume that accidents were caused by component failures, particularly by failure operators. It's always the pilot's fault or the driver's fault. At least that's what we claimed. We're now starting to see losses in systems where nothing failed. Even the operator did the right thing. But instead, there was a design error in the system design. Even in cases where there is operator error, it's usually the result of designing systems where operator error is inevitable, and then we blame the results on the operator rather than the designer. And the Boeing 737 MAX accidents are a classic example now. Each component of the system in some of these accidents is actually 100% reliable, but the system can be unsafe.
One of the things that's very difficult, at least for myself, and it comes both from a position of perhaps relative ignorance, but also um, relative bias, as someone who spent about a decade in federal service, um, knowing how big, large acquisition processes work, having spent a number of years working at Raytheon, et cetera. One of the big pushes, Nancy, and you're very well aware of this, I'm sure, by the Defense Innovation Board, for example, is to turn to, I hate to say it, but to turn to a lot of the development processes that you are raising concern around. So DevSecOps, etc. And considering these things, we're talking about NC3 here today specifically, but I think this conversation is actually far more broad-reaching. These ideas are for the Department of Defense more broadly, is to not just go with COTS, right, but to actually go with these industry processes that are becoming more of a standard today within software companies, but that don't really match up with the bar that you're noting needs to be set when considering these large projects that really cannot afford to fail, right? So a couple of shuttle accidents are pretty dramatic, pretty awful incidents to watch, but also just bureaucratically within those organizations, the ripple effect. I can't even fathom NC3 with those sorts of accidents in mind. So I'm curious. I mean, you wrote about this in the paper. Accidents in complex systems often result from inconsistencies between the model of the process used by the controller and the actual process state. I mean, you just described that with the F-35. If DoD and other USG agencies are going to move more towards these rapid, quote unquote, agile processes for software development, would you argue that that's inherently maybe the wrong direction to be going? I mean, how do they begin to start to wrap their heads around how to develop more reliable software, particularly in the NC3 context?
I'm puzzled by the Defense Department's looking toward Silicon Valley as the guide. People don't remember the blue screen of death and how we used to get that
Yeah.
on Microsoft systems, and we still have errors. But we don't care. Humans are really flexible when all we're doing is just trying to look up some news or do something else. So we get a glitch, we don't even think about it. We just sit and we just change and try something else, and we may not even remember all the problems that occurred. Um, but that's not what we need for NC3 systems. I mean, we need incredible amounts of reliability, and more than reliability, we have to know we can trust it beforehand. How do we do that? That's really the problem. The agile techniques are fun. for the developers. They don't have to plan. They get to go play around and figure out what they're going to do as they go along, instead of writing requirements. One of the things the shuttle program did, and most successful previous big critical projects, were really nail down the requirements and get everything designed before they started building code or before they started doing detailed design.
Yeah.
And that, for some reason, people say, well, you can't do that. Well, you may not be able to do that with websites and productivity tools, but we better know what we're building before we build an NC3 system, because we can't afford to do it like Lego blocks and just sort of stick them together in any old way and then change our mind and move them around. I mean, we're talking about enormous systems. Do you know that the software on the car that you're driving today, not these fancy autonomous ones, but the one you're driving today, has 100 million lines of software on it? I mean, you don't get that by just sorting, well, let's just see what we're going to do, and we won't figure out what we're going to do beforehand. It's just not going to happen. We've got to stop making these false analogies. The Department of Defense, now, you're right. I mean, the big thing is rapid development and rapid deployment. Basically, that means build it fast and don't test it very much. Well, you absolutely save money at the beginning. The problem is the cost of these systems in the long run is going to be enormous, because you're going to have to go back and fix what you did. And once you've done it wrong, it's very hard to fix, very expensive to fix.
Yeah. And I'm curious, because you know so in such granular detail about how these systems, how it plays out when you've got those sorts of problems. I mean, one of the things that we've come to understand through a lot of these conversations we've been having about 21st century NC3 is a desire and maybe even a push for flexibility, for agility, and a capability inherent to these systems to be able to react and adjust on a 24/7 ongoing basis. And so we talked to Eric Gross, who is the retired VP from Google, for their security and privacy, and he talks about how Google dealt with this on a day-to-day basis, taking on everything from the GRU to average everyday white hat, black hat hackers, and being able to stay resilient through that flexibility. As you were describing it, it's hard for me to imagine. It's really hard for me to imagine an NC3 system reliant on code that can actually be as flexible or adaptive or responsive as that. Is that something that you see is feasible? I mean, you note the rhetorical question in your paper of what will be needed in order to provide highly trustworthy NC3 systems of the future. The inclination appears to be that they want it to be a flexible, adaptive network. And it's really hard for me to wrap my head around how you could have something that's requirements based be so flexible. Is that feasible? I'm curious as to your thoughts.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions in there, but you're confusing agility in the system that's created versus agility in the creation process. Agile systems means agile in development process.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
they're talking about. That we want flexible systems. Absolutely, we can get that.
Okay.
But that's part of the requirements. Part of the requirements, most systems are very long lived, and you have to build them to be changed and to be flexible. And we can do that. We know how to do that. That doesn't mean we use slapdash development processes. It means our development and our planning has to be even more rigorous, because we have to figure out, you're going to have to plan for this. It doesn't happen magically. You're going to have to plan for the ability to have reconfigured networks on the fly to do these things. It's possible to do, and it's possible even to do in a trustworthy manner. but that doesn't mean that you start building them and then just decide to change them on the fly later, or without planning for how you do those things. Also, you mentioned something about going to Google for security. That sounds a little strange to me. They're going to places that have terrible security and terrible problems, and think that they're somehow, because they have so many problems, they're experts on it.
So are we doomed to failure then, Nancy? I mean, that all sounds pretty depressing.
It's not depressing. I mean, if we could do it in the past, we can do it now. There are ways of doing these things. The first thing you have to know is, and start from a basic premise, that quality is built into a system. You don't test it in, you don't put it in later, and somehow build anything and then make it somehow high quality. I'm sure you understand that with just the products you build. There are certain companies that build really high quality products, but they're usually much more expensive because they spend more time in development and in building the quality in. It's easy to build low quality systems. It's very hard to build high quality systems, but we can do it and we know how to do it. So I talked about using really rigorous planning. We used to do a lot of system analysis. So before we started building a system, and maybe it was because it was new, we weren't so sure of ourselves. We used a lot of system analysis before. And now people are feeling, I think, more comfortable. And they say, oh, well, we don't have to plan ahead. We can just build this thing. I know how to do this. And we don't even teach this in the schools. We don't teach people how to do system analysis. I taught a software engineering course once, and the students were appalled that I made them write requirements for the thing they were building beforehand. We don't teach them how to do it, and we don't teach them how to build simple systems, how not to abuse complexity. And so there's even a contest in the schools, the Rube Goldberg contest, which it's a nationwide contest for the students to see who can build the most unnecessarily complex design for the simplest problem. That's what we're teaching them. And it's a fun contest if it's just taken as a fun contest, but we aren't teaching them to do it right. So people don't understand most of the complexity we put into systems is gratuitous complexity. It's unnecessary complexity.
So, Nancy, what is the appropriate level of complexity then?
Well, it depends upon the problem you're solving. There's a basic level of complexity in the problem you're solving. So NC3 is going to have a basic level of complexity, but making it more complex than it need be, which is what we usually do, isn't going to help. We need to strip it down to what we actually have to do, and then use good system engineering processes and careful design, testing, and so on after we've created these things.
Nancy, you asked this question, what will be needed to provide highly trustworthy nuclear command and control communication systems in the future? What then are the distinguishing features that separate the necessary or that separate what would be a successful NC3 project from an unsuccessful one?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. For a complex system, I don't even know what the requirements are.
Well, you've talked about avoiding unnecessary complexity. How would you strip the system to its basics?
The basic problem is that we need to develop simple designs instead of gratuitous designs. Instead of adding stuff that's supposedly intelligent because we call it intelligent and we don't have any way to figure out how we could possibly develop great trust in it, we usually don't need that. We usually need regular old software requirements. I don't see any need for artificial intelligence, for example, in an NC3 system, and we shouldn't be using it because we'll never get there. If we look back at the old systems, so, we've had to deal with the problem of accidental detonation of nuclear weapons and nuclear bombs for 70 years we've had them. And at the very beginning, the engineers realized that there was no way to figure out every possible thing that could go wrong. And instead, they came up with absolutely a brilliant, amazingly simple solution that has been effective now for the last 70 years. And it required some thought and development, but it's brilliant. What I see now is, and what I'm afraid is, we're going to take those elegant solutions, but very effective, very reliable solutions. And in building our new systems, we're going to forget about those, and we're going to try and use all kinds of sexy new things, AI, agile development, all these things, and lose the trustworthiness. I think I talked about stripping systems of their basics using rigorous professional development processes. We also need to acknowledge the limitations of today's technology. And instead of using fancy new techniques for which we have no way of assuring that they will work, and then trying to delude ourselves that they're safer because we said these are intelligent systems, so they're going to be safe. We need to accept the limits of what we can do today, and at the same time develop new approaches to stretch those limits. Our limits today are intellectual, they're not technical. We can build software to do anything. I call this the curse of flexibility. You can build a software to do enormously complex things. The problem is you can't be sure it's going to always work. And it's different than we used to have. With hardware, purely hardware systems, it's much harder to build something more complex. So we were limited by the physical nature of the materials we were using. Today, with software, it's all an abstraction. There's no limit to the complexity that we can build. And so we do, without understanding there are intellectual limits. There aren't physical limits anymore. There are also limits in testing that we used to not have. We used to be able to test systems pretty well. When you have a physical component and you test it at point B and you test it at point A, and you can pretty much assure that all the points in between, this thing isn't going to break. And so what you do is you just keep adding more interval testing until you get to the point where it breaks, and now we know how strong it's going to be. With software, between points A and B, it could break anywhere in any of the points. I've built systems. I help with a system called TCAS, which is help get certified, which is a collision avoidance system used on nearly every aircraft today. And we did build a model, and there are 10 to the 40th states in TCAS. That's a 1 with 40 zeros after it. There's no way you can test even a small fraction of that. Doesn't mean we shouldn't test. We have to test. But it also means we're going to have to derive our confidence in ways other than just testing.
Nancy, often humans are the failure point in complex systems, or the organizational design may inadvertently be the cause of failure. How do humans and organizations, procedures, cultures figure in this? I guess you could call it, or you have called it, socio-technical approach.
Well, let me just suggest a different view of whether operators are really the cause of all accidents. The pilots are always blamed for accidents. That doesn't mean that they were the cause. It's very convenient to blame them. It's very hard to see when a design error or when a management pressures or productivity pressures or the context, the design of the interfaces, all of those things are harder to see. So we just blame the operator for doing the wrong thing. But there's also the issue of looking at what you alluded to about socio-technical approaches. The engineers really like to focus on the technical parts of the system. And managers who probably don't really understand much of the technical like to focus on the management system parts. And what we have is a disconnect between these. Our systems, these are socio-technical systems. They have to be both designed technically and managed um, in a way that will achieve our goals. And we can't do that by separating out these things. We need to have techniques, we need to have approaches that will integrate the social and the technical aspects of the design of a system.
So, Nancy, what are the implications of this socio-technical approach for management? Certainly at the top, but probably at all levels of management.
I think that what we need, especially, are socio-technical approaches to operating and managing these systems. The problem is that often the management really is making decisions without understanding really the state of the technical system that they're managing or all the implications of it. Um, so we have people, we have managers who think that perhaps that the systems are more capable than they are and make bad decisions as a result. Or they think the systems are being maintained and inspected properly when they're not. We need to design the management of operations, the operating of these systems, the operating environment as rigorously as we design the technical parts of the system.
If I could actually jump in here too, and maybe go back to another piece of this that you were just describing, Nancy, which you also wrote about in the paper, which is considering the shuttle example and some of the other large scale projects that you noted that you've been a part of. Um, that some of the traditional hazard analysis techniques may not work real well for this software intensive engineering environment, and you note that things will need to be, quote, considerably changed and improved. And we've talked a little bit about this when considering maybe how some of the best in practice, if you will, from a industry standpoint look like. And DoD's really struggled to try to figure out how to get to what you're describing. I'm curious as to your thoughts as to what you feel that needs to be considerably changed and improved, and how they could get about doing that.
Well, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. The types of errors, the types of failures, the types of problems we're having are really different than what we had 70 years ago, 50 years ago, when almost all the safety analysis techniques that we created existed. I mean, at that time we didn't have software and or they weren't doing critical things in these systems. The world has changed, the kinds of problems have changed, but we're using the same techniques and they're losing their effectiveness. Uh, Human roles are changing. Humans aren't just pushing buttons, they're managing things. They're not directly controlling the hardware at all. There's always software in between. But but the old techniques assume that accidents are caused by hardware failures, and that's just no longer true. And they can't be extended. I tried for many years and they can't be extended. We really need to change paradigms. We need to come up with new, more powerful engineering analysis methods. Um, we're relying on our systems today being correct, safe, and secure, but unfortunately, for systems like NC3, this goal is impossible today just because we don't have the engineering tools. We need completely new paradigms in engineering. Instead, we're relying on new technology. that
Yeah.
can't be assured, and say, well, it's more complex. It's newer. It has nicer, more names for it. It must be better. Um, and so we need to invest. We're investing a lot in sexy technology. We're not investing a lot in the less sexy problems of how do we model and analyze and assure that these systems will do what we want and won't do what we don't want.
You describe in your paper some of those more novel engineering techniques that you've seen be successful in trying to do what you're describing, and the listeners will have a chance to read the pieces that you kind of start to lay out a little bit there. But would you mind speaking a little bit to what you've seen in terms of some of those novel engineering approaches that may actually help anticipate some of these new types of mistakes, errors, and accidents?
First, look at what's not working. Why are we having accidents today? Uh,
Hmm.
if here's one. It was a plane that was landing in Warsaw, Poland, and it was a heavy rainstorm outside. And the pilot landed the plane and tried to turn on the reverse thrusters. The reverse thrusters means what they are, you reverse the thrust of the engine against the direction you're going. So it stops the engine, like putting on the brakes. Uh, the problem is that it's very dangerous to apply the reverse thrust when you're in the air, because you can imagine if you're in the air and you stop forward propulsion, you go splat, and you crash. So they put protection into the software, and that it wouldn't ever allow the reverse thrusters to be actuated while the plane was in the air. So now what happened in Warsaw was it landed. There was a lot of runway water on the runway. The wheels hyperplaned and all these other things, and all the clues that the software used to decide that the plane had landed weren't true at the time. So the
Hmm.
pilot tried to activate the reverse thrusters, and the software wouldn't let it because it said it's
Yeah.
unsafe. And it went off the end of the runway and ran into a small hill and caught on fire. Now, um, if you look at that, nothing failed there. The pilot did the right thing. The software did the right thing. It did exactly what it was told to do. The problem is that there are so many conditions now that engineers have to think of, but we can no longer plan and for all of the conditions and think of all of them that could possibly happen. So we're having these I call interaction accidents. They're really in the design of the overall system. They're not in the reliability of the components. Now, the old techniques, the standard safety analysis techniques, try and keep components from failing. But what about these accidents where nothing failed? They all worked. The problem was in what engineering we call unknown unknowns, the things that we can't possibly know beforehand. And the reason we don't know them beforehand is our tools aren't powerful enough. We could know them beforehand. And that's the kind of things that I'm working on, my students are working on. We're going to have to change this paradigm, continuing to pretend that all accidents are caused by a component failure. And that includes an NC3, that the problems are going to be caused by a failure of the network or a failure of one piece of the system, is just untrue. Those things we handle and know how to handle pretty well. It's the other ones that we don't, the interaction accidents, the problem of dealing with all of these potential interactions that we cannot now predict. Um, and there are ways of dealing with it and creating new techniques on this, but it requires investment. And I don't see anyone much investing in these.
Nancy, a former commanding officer of a ballistic missile firing submarine wrote to me this morning and said, and I'm quoting here, it is impossible for an unauthorized launch to take place because of the way procedures are set up and rigorously drilled into and followed by the crew, quote unquote. Given what you just said about interaction accidents, unknown unknowns, etc., do you think one should be using the phrase impossible with reference to NC3 systems in that manner? It seems to me that's such an absolute conviction that was expressed that it makes me really wonder about the confidence level, shall we say.
Well, I mean, if you don't want to build them, then you can use the word impossible. And that you shouldn't use that as an excuse for, well, we'll just build them anyway and we'll just not worry about it. Um, there are two approaches here. The first is to limit the functionality and the complexity. Now, that functionality and complexity aren't the same thing. You have lots of functions, but put them together in a non-complex way, in a very understandable way. Uh, you but you have to make some limits on what you do. You can't build enormously complex and uncontrolled with and unnecessary complexity in the systems, and at the same time have confidence. So we need to limit somewhat the way we build these systems, but at the same time stretch the limits and the intellectual limits. The limits now today are not physical or logical. The limits are intellectual. The people who are trying to build these systems. We need tools that will allow us to stretch those limits. I absolutely believe we could build an NC3 system that what I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I've read a little about it and it certainly seems feasible to me, but not the way we're building them today, building systems today. And we're going to have to do a lot more careful analysis of what we actually have to do versus what we would like to do.
Well, can I just sort of turn the problem backwards, so as to speak? Do you ever see organizations adjusting what is an incredibly demanding mission to being either simpler or less demanding in order to ensure the safe and secure control systems work to a necessary level of reliability and safety? I mean, what I'm getting at here is that building an NC3 system that simply supports a minimal deterrent, maybe just on submarines, versus one that also supports bombers, also supports land based missiles, also supports tactical nuclear weapons, nuclear warfighting for limited nuclear wars or for protracted nuclear wars, and through all that is still able to end a nuclear war by presumably issuing stop firing orders and being able to negotiate with what's left of the adversary after a nuclear war. The NC3 system demands are very different. Do you ever see organizations actually adjust their mission in order to achieve reliable, safe, secure command and control communication systems?
There are two separate things that are being confused here, I think. There's a difference between the mission and the technology or the way you achieve the mission. All right. That doesn't mean you necessarily, if you can change the way you achieve the mission, you don't necessarily have to make compromises in the mission itself. The question is, what is the overall mission? I actually just got a research grant from the DoD to look at this issue of tying together aircraft, space systems, Navy vessels, Army tanks, and all of them somehow work together. And we're going to look at that. I mean, but the I don't think it's impossible to do, but we have to do it in in a careful manner, and in the interactions have to be designed to be simple, not necessarily the mission. So there's a difference between, I don't believe you. I believe we can achieve many of these missions. The question is the two things that are still up for still need to be understood is how do we successfully take out again gratuitous complexity and strip these down to what really needs and must be done. And the other is how do we show that the result is safe and secure? And the way you show things are safe and secure is you build them in from the beginning. People keep thinking you can add this on at the end, that you can figure out whether it's secure later, or you can assure that it's safe after the fact. You can't. If it's not safe, you're not going to test it in, you're not going to assure it in. It has to be there, safe and secure from the very beginning, which means we have to design these things from the very beginning to have safety and security. Is this feasible? Absolutely. I mean, we're showing how to do that. The Air Force is applying a lot of our new techniques now on some of their most complex new systems, and they're finding that they work. But what it requires again is a lot of upfront planning, upfront development of requirements, upfront analysis of what actually needs to be done and what is the easiest, most reliable way to achieve that. Not just jump into, well, we always have an internet, we always have this protocol, so we're going to have to do that this time. That second way just isn't going to work.
Nancy, in other domains like air traffic control, many other sort of high tech and software intensive activities, we find that there is a convergence and even negotiation of global standards of performance. Do you think there's any room to come to some common, either tacit or explicit understanding between designers and operators of these NC3 systems as to at least what would be best practice and desirable, even if there's no transparency as to how a given nuclear weapons state operates in this domain?
It's not that they have to come to an agreement. What we need is if we're going to build in quality and we're going to build these things from the beginning, safety and security and usability, we need to have the operators as part of the development team at the very beginning, building the requirements, helping to design these things, making sure they're operable before we build them. And we've had horrible problems with air traffic control systems. And we spent billions of dollars in canceled projects because they never bothered to get the air traffic controllers involved. And then they get to testing and then they get to deployment and the air traffic controller says, we can't use this. This won't work. All they needed to do was include them from the very beginning. So this is part of the socio-technical thing. It also includes operations. It includes getting everyone involved in the development process. I'd like to give one other example of changing paradigms, of changing the way we think about solving problems, and that's the problem of security. We are absolutely failing at security. I'm sure you are getting all the messages and notices from companies every month that I am that all my information has been stolen. I have a security clearance and all DOD, even the DOD computers they stole them from. So, Chinese know more about me than my mother does now. The problem is that we're stuck in one thing that doesn't work. So we have two approaches to security today. Keep the bad guys out and protect information. And neither of them are working. So keeping the bad guys out, we know doesn't work. As long as you're going to have a connection to the outside world, someone can abuse that connection and get in. And
Yep.
people are not willing to compromise and not have that connection to the outside world. So keeping people out is impossible. I had a graduate student, he's a master's student in computer science at MIT, and we were working on a project actually on aircraft security, commercial airlines security, and we needed some information from Boeing. And they were really being slow about getting it to us, and we really needed it. So he came into my office and he said, well, do you want me to just break into their system and steal it? So, I was appalled. So we got a little lecture on engineering ethics. We did not break in and steal it, but that's the attitude today. We cannot keep people out. The second thing we try and do is protect information, and we focus on protecting information. In safety, that's not in these NC3 systems. That's not the problem. Looking at a car, we need to protect in a car the functionality, like the braking system or the steering system, not the driver's social security number. And we're all focused on protecting the social security number and think that the same approaches will help with the function, and they'll say a security, and it won't. So what it really means is that we need to again change our paradigm. I had a very bright PhD student a few years ago, Colonel Bill Young of the U.S. Air Force, and his PhD dissertation was about a totally new approach to security that uses the same approach as my safety approaches. The basic ideas is you can't keep people out. So stop putting all your effort into keeping people out and instead make sure that they don't do anything harmful if they do get in. It doesn't matter to me whether the operator accidentally launches this nuclear weapon because they made a mistake or because some enemy got in and confused them and made them do it. It's the same thing. I want to prevent the launch of the weapon, and I can actually usually do it in exactly the same way. Now, does this approach work? Well, so far it's showing that it does. Again, this is the approach now being used in some very critical new Air Force systems. But changing paradigms is very hard. There's a tremendous amount of money being made today by people and companies selling the old security approaches. They don't work so well, and safety, by the way. They don't work so well, but as we've seen, but they're known and they can provide tremendous profits to those who are selling them. If something isn't working, despite enormous amounts of effort and money being put in it, then simply trying to do more of it doesn't seem like the right approach to follow. We need to look for new approaches, not just double down on the old ones or those that aren't working today. And so, if we really want to I don't think it's not going to take 30 years to get new approaches to these things. We can do them very quickly if we stopped encouraging and giving people to keep doing the old things or keep trying to improve things that don't work, and instead encourage people to look for breakthroughs through new paradigms, for totally new ways of solving our problems.
Sounds like maybe we should join forces and start a company.
Well, I have actually.
I mean, and just to riff on this for a moment, the former White House official Richard Clarke and a former colleague of mine from the NSC, Rob Kanaki, they've just recently released a book called The Fifth Domain, and they're asserting something similar to what you are, with a little bit of a different bent at the end of the assertion, which is you're not going to keep people out. You're not going to solve that problem. Everything is not going to be, firewalled off to the point where you can consider yourself defended. It's a multi-layered, tiered approach that combines a number of different tools that, honestly, it doesn't shift the paradigm, but they would argue that for big, large corporations that have begun to protect themselves in these ways, it gets after the same solution that you're describing, which is they're going to get in, but at least you can prevent them from doing any real damage. I'd be very interested in what the paradigm shift looks like to actually get to a point that you don't necessarily need 17 different security products to protect your network. That you can do something radically different that actually gets you to the point where maybe they do get in, but you can ensure that they don't get the company jewels or make a nuclear weapon go off. It's a fascinating assertion that we could actually get to a point where that's
Well,
the
it
case.
works. And we know we know how to do the analysis. It's not just a theoretical thing. We know how to do the analysis. It turns out to be the same as our safety analysis, and we're doing it now on real military systems. It works, but there's a lot of inertia, uh, and there's
Yeah.
also a tremendous amount of money being made now doing things
Yep.
the old way because they're so expensive to do the old things. It's much
Sure.
cheaper to do it to change. We're finding that with our safety techniques. They're much cheaper than the old traditional ones. But getting people to change what they've always done and always known is difficult. You start with actually the young people. Uh, One of my
Mhm.
favorite writers, the great philosopher Douglas Adams, the man who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy,
Yeah.
wrote that if anything that was invented before you were born is considered to be the natural way things work. Anything invented between your age of 15 and 35 is something you figure you can get a career out of. Anything invented after the age of your age of 35 is useless and should be uh, railed against, prevented. Um, and that's what I'm finding. I'm finding that our new paradigms are really appealing to the young people who aren't
Yeah.
already all invested in the old ones, and they look at they say, well, of course we do that, and then I teach them the
Yep.
old ones and they say, why would anybody do that? Well, that's what they're all doing. It's a difficult. um, uh, Thomas Kuhn, who
Yep.
was a philosopher, right? A professor at the
Yep.
University of California, Berkeley, wrote about uh, the nature of scientific revolution. And I've read a lot of his books and a lot of his stuff because I'm living it. um, so I can have great empathy for what he's saying. And he was right. It's exactly, he said exactly the way it works. It's difficult and sometimes takes a very long time to change paradigms. But one way we could for NC3 or for any of these other things is the DoD deciding it needs to be done because the DoD has the power and the money to do it quickly.
And I'll be honest, I think this is actually one of the more optimistic endings to one of our conversations here so far when it comes to all things NC3. I'll be totally candid with you, Nancy. I think the assertion, that it can be done, but also that the path is relatively clear and that you just need to make sure that you're building it in from the outset. And it sounds like some of those who need to be doing so are working with folks like yourself to make sure that that's happening. And I think that's in some part, or actually maybe even in large part, as to why we're having these conversations, is to make sure that we're finding the best practices that can be embedded into these processes and make sure that people are doing them. Nothing wrong, right? Nothing wrong with DevSecOps, but it may not necessarily be the best approach for developing NC3 software systems. I really wanted to say thank you for all of your time, Nancy. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks as always to Peter as well for joining in here and helping ask astute questions. As always, thanks again to our listeners for joining us here today. We'll be back next week with a new episode of The Fourth Leg. As always, hit us up on Twitter, subscribe to the pod via SoundCloud, sign up for more Tech4GS information via our website, or just shoot us a note, email info@tech4gs.org. Until then, thanks to everyone for listening. We look forward to hearing from you.